Hi everyone, welcome to THT. I hope everybody got a very happy Christmas. And as we are heading to 2025, I thought that it would be a good idea to do a little recap, a little wrap up of the competitive landscapes of 2024. I'm making this video for several reasons. The first one is that I think it would be a good way to wrap up the year. The second reason is that I wanted to have this sort of this video as a document, an historical document for the future. So whenever, like, let's say 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, even 10 years down the line, if you want to look back on what the meta looked like in 2024 and what were the major decks, the major timestamps in 2024, I guess you can just come back to that video and that's give you just everything you need to know. And the third reason is obviously for people who haven't been following Star Wars Unlimited very closely in 2024 and want to know what happened in the meta throughout the year. I think this is also a good video for you as well. So obviously I'm not going to talk about every single deck that has made a result in tournaments in 2024. That would just be way too many decks. I just focused on the deck that had the most influence, the deck that you will see the most often, and the deck that made the most striking, the most impressive results. I didn't put those in any in orders of importance. I put them in order of chronological, like pretty much starting from the deck that were very in the early meta, then in order to kind of show the evolution of the meta and kind of explain how that works. So obviously this is entirely subjective, and I decided to select 8 lists for set 1, 8 lists for set 2, and 4 lists for set 3. Why only 4 lists for set 3? Simply because we only half season. The PQ season hasn't even started yet, so we don't have that many information and deck list to go from. So without further ado, let's go into the first obviously the first set, Spark of Rebellion. So very early on in Spark of Rebellion, there were 3 decks that emerged as part of the meta, and one of those decks was Krennic Green. Krennic Green actually won the very first major tournaments in Spark of Rebellion. What I mean by major tournaments is any tournament that has more than 100 players. That's basically kind of my definition of what a major tournament is. And Avastator, which is currently one of the best player in Poland still today, and a player that I play test with very often, won the tournament with this Krennic mid-range deck, which is very reminiscent to the kind of what we call back then a control deck. Back then, hard control did not exist, and this is pretty much as control as it gets, as far as like the kind of decks that you would want to play. This is how a control deck looked like very early on in set 1. And Avastator won this it's about 100 player tournaments in Poland, which was the first big tournament that we had for Star Wars Unlimited. As you can see, it is very reminiscent to the Kira decks we see today, even the Krennic deck we see today. It's just good stuff, mid-range ramp. Obviously green-black has been one of the most powerful color combination in the game, and very early on we identified that. So it's just a very solid list that can kind of beat everything, that win the late game against most decks, but doesn't auto-lose to aggro by any mean. Back in those days, of course, ECL was heavily used. Because Steadfast Battalion was great combo with ECL, and so was Gideon, so lots of great ECL targets in this deck, and yeah, that's what the deck looks like. Also, one of the first time we started using Cargo Juggernaut, which was identified as a very strong card. So this deck does not feature Vigilance. I think Vigilance out of aspect was not played early on in Spark of Rebellion. And to be fair, I don't think it would have been better than Cargo Juggernaut, because in those times, of course, control decks were not really a thing. Hard control were not a thing, so milling was not really a thing. So in a much more mid-range and aggro meta, I would rather just play Cargo Juggernaut most of the time. Moving on, of course, we got the list of Mr. Cool, forgot the real name of the person, but he basically, this is the boba green list that took down the Twickenham 222 players, one of the biggest tournaments ever organized for Star Wars Unlimited. It was very early on, so most people didn't really know how to play the game so well, but it was by far one of the biggest early tournament that we had in Star Wars Unlimited, and it was and the top 8 was entirely made of boba green. So obviously boba green, we knew it was going to be the best deck, everybody knew it, but here it was kind of like the confirmation, and this was the number one position here. It's very classic list, the way it was built in Spark of Rebellion, very tempo based on Steadfast Battalions in CL, try to get a massive turn 5 play with all the good stuff from Fire Spray. Boba Green in set 1 was extremely powerful. It was the best deck in the game, but I think in my opinion it was more counterable than what it was in set 2. We'll get over that afterwards. And it was obviously a very, very powerful deck, but it was definitely a deck that was counterable. I think the Krennic deck that we saw earlier had a pretty decent matchup against Boba Green, and later on we'll see what happened. But at this time, early on in set 1, Boba Green was super, super dominant. And even over the other version of Boba Green, Boba Yellow was not nearly as good as it was in set 2. Boba Red was same for Boba Red, so Boba Green was completely dominant as far as the Boba decks was concerned, and it was also the most powerful deck in the meta by far early on in set 1. The third deck, obviously, that was a big part of the early meta in Star Wars Limited was obviously Sabine as being the king of aggro, and Sabine Green specifically because of ECL interaction with Steadfast Battalion. Once again, Steadfast Battalions, you can see, was super played early on in set 1 in all the 3 major decks where there was one card in common, and that card was Steadfast Battalion, which is very interesting because this card is basically gonna fell off hardly after in set 2 and set 3. So this is kind of this one is the one that did number 6 at Star City Game Con 4K, which is much later on chronologically to where we are now, but I didn't find any better like major tournament winner Sabine Green earlier than that. Early in the meta, Sabine Green was having issues having strong performances in tournaments. They were present in top 8s irregularly, but never really had like a win or proper clean like win thing. So it was hard for me to pick a list, but I decided to pick the earliest, biggest wins for Sabine Green. Here was this 6th position here in Star City Game. Sabine Green in set 1 was heavily played because it was the most powerful aggro deck, but it was not nearly as good as it was in set 2. I think really set 2 is what brought Sabine Green to the next level, in my opinion. So we move on a bit more in the timeline, and at this moment, this is where I started winning. I won the Take the Initiative tournament with Anne Solo Green, and I was very early on in the started to put Anne Green, but only when at that moment that people started to pick up the deck. I could have picked up any other Han Green that did some more higher tournaments wins with this deck. But I've decided to pick my list because I was the first one who brought this deck to the table, at least publicly, and so I think that the vast majority of people who were playing Han Green in set 1 basically took it from my initial list. So this is the list I won Take Initiative with. The only difference I think is that the V-Wing was 2 Vanguard Ace, and that was not a split because Vanguard Ace and V-Wing was 2 Vanguard Ace. Anyway, but the rest of the list is pretty much there. It was a very fun deck to play with. Not necessarily, I think it's a deck that fell off a lot in the upcoming meta, mostly because it's a deck that was heavily based on white-green, and white-green just didn't get any new cards. So it really didn't make sense to continue to play white-green while white-yellow was keep adding more cards, especially double-yellow as well. So yeah, it's a deck that fell off simply because green-white just didn't get anything. I'm obviously not excluding the possibility that this deck might come back, especially in set 4, sorry. But in set 1, this deck was very competitive, and it was it's still today my favorite deck ever to play with. Really fun deck. Moving on to the big win here with Geekoen Vader Blue. Vader Blue was the first person who brought a hard control deck to a tournament and did a performance with it was a player called Idre Ethel, who he did top 10 in a Twickenham tournament with his Iden Blue, but his win did not have a massive influence on the meta because it was only a top 10 win, and so relatively few players picked up hard control. Really, the deck that really brought hard control to the meta was the deck of Geekoen his Vader Blue deck's win in the 5K Orlando, which was back in those days, it was the biggest US tournament at that time. So it was pretty big I think it still is the biggest US tournament ever organized, as far as I know. I think it was not 200 player, but it was like 100 feet, like it was pretty big. Basically, yes, so this is what Hot Control really looked like in the mid part of Spark of Rebellion. We saw the out of aspect vigilance, the meal plan, the meal game plan, which was really like a big thing. That really was the thing that most people overlooked. That made this deck possible and just an incredibly powerful deck. And pretty much every single Hot Control deck you see today is just an evolution of this initial deck. So obviously a huge influential deck into the meta. Once again, it's not the first person who made a significant tournament result with Hot Control, but it is by far the one that triggered everybody to start picking up this deck and taking this deck very seriously. Then we got another evolution of the Hot Control archetype, this one using Aiden, and this was the Aiden Blue of Jordan Hanning, that he won the 4K Richmond with this tournament. So he actually, this is written top 16 on there, but he won the tournament. And this is like another evolution of the Hot Control deck, focusing on trying to win the mirror match, as you can see here, with this Search for Feelings, Spark of Rebellions in the main deck, and double restock in the main deck. So it's kind of like a initial evolution of Aiden Blue. And most of the Hot Control moving forward started going away from Vader and tried to pick up Aiden instead. And we saw the players I was talking about earlier, the French player, either Ethel, actually bringing up Aiden Blue and winning one of the days at the UK Game Expo with Aiden Blue. I decided to not feature on this video because it would be pretty much the same kind of deck as this one, but he did win UK Game Expo with Aiden Blue as well. So a very significant deck. So one of the players who won the UK Game Expo, was this Vader Grain list, which is another list that I think was that had been played throughout the Spark of Rebellion meta and was regularly making result, but this time it was one of the days of the UK Game Expo was won by this Vader Grain deck. Yeah, it's pretty much just the ram into the Vader, very powerful. And when the major innovation of that Vader deck is like most Vaders so far were playing ECL, and he started bringing basically Vader with Command Center, and it turns out that it made the deck a lot better, especially against aggro. And the ECL approach was just a little bit too greedy, even though it was very strong in some matchups. It was a little bit too greedy in general, so this list was a lot more balanced and allowed him to get a tournament win. It's on the UK Game Expo, so it was actually just a day one day, and it was kind of weird because there's no top cut, so but it was but I think this tournament, so this deck saw a significant amount of play in set 1, and this one is by far the one that did the biggest performance. Then we got another undefeated UK Game Expo day. That was the deck of Howard Williams, which is the expert of the Palpatine Blue, the deck that he's been playing, and he's recently dubbed. So it's funny because Howard did day 1 undefeated in UK Game Expo. He also did top 2 in second place, in Manchester in set 2, and in set 3 he did second place, as you know, in Birmingham. So he's an extremely consistently strong player. He basically does insane performances in almost all the decks, all the tournaments he plays it. He has this faculty of dodging aggro matchup, which is pretty insane. But yeah, no, he's a very good player, and he's also kind of like I need to feature at least one Palpatine deck in this set 1 environment, because Palpatine was very much a threat in this meta where aggro was not as strong as it is today. So obviously I need to feature his one of his lists. So this is the list that he was playing in Spark of Rebellion. Very greedy, very late game powerful deck. So this is kind of like, as the meta shift a little bit more towards control, Palpatine decks started to become really, really popular and really powerful. So this is basically this was basically the set 1 8 deck that I've selected for set 1 meta. As you can see, it was mostly a meta based around boba and then control decks. Control decks were the counters to boba. Agro had a hard time to exist in set 1 because he was heavily countered by boba. This left some people playing some very greedy decks. But this was about to change in Shadow of the Galaxy. So Shadow of the Galaxy, couple of things that happened. First of all, the introduction of the new Han, and the first consequence of this is that we're seeing a lot more mid-range heroism deck. The most early one, so this one is from Frank forgot his second name, sorry. And this was, he did, so I don't know, I think it was like a top 4, I think he did a very good result in one of the Gen Con days, and this was the early, I'm putting this because it was the strongest early performance of a Han blue decks in the meta, which turned out to be a deck that you would play a lot. Basically, Han blue kind of fixed the issues that Luke Red had in set 1. It was a little bit slow. And Han was able to play those big units earlier, which allowed him to keep up with the tempo of the meta. And this is what made this deck incredibly powerful. I still believe it is a very strong deck. Unfortunately, in today's meta, Tarkin Town is everywhere, making it very difficult to play Han blue, in my opinion. Then obviously one thing that happens in set 2 obviously is that we got a lot of strong yellow-white cards, including the combo Tech DJ being much better on double yellow. We got also, so basically with the higher amount of cards that you could play in yellow, it just made more sense to transition from playing Han green to Han yellow and take a much more aggressive tempo-y stance. Also, Han had trouble against aggro, and the answer to that was to play Cunning. Cunning was effectively the answer that Han Yellow needed to beat aggro, because in set 2, with the introduction of Wrecker and Poe, it was almost impossible for Han Green to exist. It was just being out-countered by those cards, because now Sabine had multiple ways to one-shot Han. And basically Cunning was effectively the answer to this, so the deck was strong against aggro because of Cunning, and also because he was able to race, notably with Surprise Strike. And the deck was also stronger against control because of the Tech DJ combo and the ability to play DJ for 7, and notably, of course, playing also Kira. The fact that the game simply had more powerful yellow cards mean that it was easier to play a monocolored deck than it was in set 1. So mono yellow Han basically took over, and since then it's been the preferred options to play Han, and it had a significant impact in set 2, and even still sees some play in set 3, obviously. So very strong deck. Troy is the one that was the first one to get a significant result with the winning one of the days of Gen Con with the 8-1 record. Another person who won a Gen Con day was Kira Green with Wu, who is also a YouTuber, so I invite you to check out his channel if you don't want to know if you want to know more about him. He's a very, very good player, and he's basically won Gen Con with his Kira Green, which was the new evolution of Krennic. It turns out that now that aggro player had ability to one-shot, basically the introduction of Wrecker and Poe in Sabine changed completely the way we deal with those decks, and basically it was just too many ways to one-shot Krennic, meaning Krennic was less useful, and then we prefer to have Kira, which helps dealing with Boba as a leader, helps dealing with all those high health units like Poe and Wrecker and all that stuff. And so the idea of the deck is pretty much exactly the same as you want from Devastator, but just evolution with the new cards and with the new leader, basically. The hidden card here is a Devastator, just so you know. 1 copy of Devastator. Then we got the new evolution of the Heart Control deck. So that's the list that won that's the list from Jordan that won the tournament in Barcelona, and to this day Barcelona is the biggest Star Wars Unlimited tournament, 256 players. So this is basically the deck list that won the biggest Star Wars Unlimited tournament ever organized. And this deck was a bit of a revolution. So far a lot of people were playing Bosk Green as a way to kind of like as a way to get rid of the bounty, and it was a pretty powerful deck. Bosk Green was basically the new Vader Green. But Bosk Blue, in my opinion, was the way that really started putting Bosk on the map as one of the strongest leader in the game. Basically, the ability for Bosk to double redeem on the bounties on the clients, on the top targets, really made the deck so much better against aggro. It's actually ludicrous that this deck list only has 2 copies of top target. But anyway. Also starting to play like the discard package. Pillage also saw a lot of play. We saw also Pillage from the hand blue list, and it was the new evolution of the Heart Control deck. Very simple as that. Next we got in my opinion the most important deck list of set 2. This is Ysera's value boba green deck. The one has 54 cards in it, even though 54 cards is obviously wrong. This deck is, in my opinion, what turned the tide and made boba being bad, basically, in my opinion. It's an incredibly powerful deck because it fixes all the problems that boba green had in set 1, which was that the deck was struggling against control. It was the fact that, and this deck is not even specifically anti-control, as you can see, it's not even running Relentless in the sideboard, which later versions of the deck will do. It was mostly basically built to beat Palpatine, I believe, with the 3 copies of True Sides. So basically, Palpatine, and this worked pretty well because he managed to win against Howard Williams in the final of this Manchester 170-player tournament. But yeah, this is basically the moment where people started to realize that this was the deck that had no weakness. In my opinion, optimized version of that deck, which would have 50-card deck and would be, of course, would have a bit more tool against control, was a deck that had no weaknesses. It's a deck that was able to win against absolutely everything. It was the most consistent. It was just incredibly difficult to beat. It could beat aggro, it could beat control, and this is, in my opinion, the deck that provoked the ban of boba. I think that obviously all boba lists were overpowered to some extent, but this one was by far the biggest offender, in my opinion. And Ysera and his boba green deck was the one that started it all in the Manchester 170 players, and it was the most influential deck list of set 2, and the one that provoked the biggest issues. Moving on, obviously I needed to talk about the Sabine green. I should have put this at the beginning of the video because this was really the list that influenced the way people started playing the game. It was the strongest early deck of the meta, and this one is a version that won the PQ at Pasadena. So the 3 biggest addition of this deck is obviously this deck. Sabine green got the biggest power spike of any decks in the meta. It was kind of it was a strong deck. It was very played in set 1 because aggros are always very popular. But it was not that powerful. I think it was mostly overplayed in set 1, and Sabine green did not really get a lot of results compared to how much it was played. But in set 2, Sabine green became one of the strongest deck in the game after boba, and the reason for this is because the deck got so much going on. It had Cassian, it had Darksaber, it had Poe Dameron, and it got Wrecker. There's just so many new tools for the decks to completely take over the game. The big difference between Sabine in set 2 and Sabine in set 1 is that Sabine set 1, once you've managed to win the early stage of the game, the game was basically won. There was not much the Sabine player could kind of take back the ball. You managed to win the board early against Sabine, then the only thing that the Sabine player could really do was to be lucky and go multiple copies of 4 cards, I believe, in, and try to get you from here. And if you get just a little bit of healing, you would basically The big difference with Sabine 2 is like Sabine in set 2 was able to take back the board. And he was able to do that thanks to ECL and Wrecker. So Wrecker and Podamron with ECL. That's the way Justico's claiming back the board. He also had more ways to reach with Cassian, and he was also had more way to punish with Darksaber. I think Darksaber is by far the least of the most important card out of those four, but it was still, of course, a big boost to the deck. Then I also wanted to mention Sabine Yellow. So in this one, I decided to take the one of the winner of PQ Paris. For this one, Sabine Yellow, Boba Yellow, in my opinion, was pretty much the new evolution of the Boba Green of set 1, so a more tempo-focused list. This list got a lot of new tools. Locking Type Phantoms was one of them. It was much more capable of dealing with its weaknesses, thanks to Locking Type Phantoms and Bazine, as a way to discard the opponent. And so it was a deck that basically compensated for the weaknesses of the set 1 Boba Green. And Boba Yellow was also a thing in set 1, but was not nearly as powerful as Boba Green in my opinion. So this Boba Yellow was just a menace in set 2, and he won just so many tournaments. And obviously the Boba Fett's armor also helped against the big mid-range decks that usually would have a pretty decent matchup against Boba. So basically Boba Yellow got so many cards that compensate for its weak matchups. Also, Boba Yellow was notorious for having a very weak 4 curve, so now we got 4 LOM, which make up for that. And of course the 4 LOM Zucus combinations for more 5-drops. It was just an incredibly powerful deck. Obviously, I just wanted to give a little mention to Ray Tarkington. This one was once again a PQ winner. There's many different versions of the deck. I selected to this one because it's the one that won a PQ and that actually I have the deck list of. And yeah, we didn't talk about Ray, but Ray was the other big contender as far as like blue, white, red decks, which were very popular in set 2. There were the new Han blue, and there was basically this deck, or the two decks that kind of play the same cards, so they're kind of like similar decks, doing similar things. But I just wanted to feature it because it was a very big part of this set 2 meta. So now let's talk about Twilight of the Republic. For this one, I've decided to select 4 decks that I think had a big impact on the meta. The first one, obviously, is Django Red. So I could have talked about Boba Red, which toward the end of set 2 had a massive impact on the meta, where he started winning loads of tournaments. But obviously, but it's a very similar deck than Django. Django is just basically a little swap, a couple of new cards with P38, and that was basically the same list. So I didn't want to talk about twice about the same, almost essentially the same deck. And also the Boba Red was really at the end of the set 3. It didn't really had a lot of time to show its full potential. But now we see, as Boba gets banned, obviously Boba gets replaced by a leader that is from set 3. One of the few leaders from set 3 that actually made it to the competitive meta, and it is Django Red. Django, obviously, as you can see, a deck that's mostly a set 2 deck, just a couple of new cards like Heavy Piercer's Tanks and the P38 is pretty much the only card that would see, and then the Cat Bane's sideboard in this. So this version is the version of Dave that did top 4 in the Birmingham, which is the biggest performance by Django Red so far. But obviously the initiators of this, I mean, I would say that pretty much everybody started building Django Red at the beginning of set 2, but the first one who did some result with this were the K2OD crews that they started playtesting for the Star City Games tournaments that have the Star City Game 1Ks, where they did some performances there. So it's not really kind of like, as I said, everybody was kind of building this deck. We also have the Soup Racers, which, and we got, of course, SIP, who also made top 8 in the so a lot of people kind of on this deck. But this version is a bit more, that I'm showing you on the screen, is a bit more reminiscent to the K2OD kind of with the flamethrowers and stuff like that. So yeah, a very strong deck, in my opinion, still one of the best deck in set 3. We'll see how this deck evolves for the rest of set 4, because throughout the deck of set 4, of set 3, sorry, throughout the PQ season of set 3. Moving on, we got another list from Yosera. This is the Palpatine yellow deck, which is, so one thing that set 3 brought to the table for Palpatine is a lot of cheap separatist units that can be defeated and leave a token behind, which is actually very strong with Palpatine Yellow. So one of the big difference between Palpatine Yellow in set 3 compared to set 1 and 2 is that Palpatine's ability in set 1 and 2 was pretty much useless, like very rarely used. It was very situational. Now this ability is used far more often because you have obviously those units that leave a unit behind when they die, that give something positive when they die. So this is once again a 55 card deck list that did top 4 in the PQ Birmingham, and it's a deck that I wanted to mention because it's become very, very popular. Obviously the combination of Change of Hearts and Palpatine stealing your opponent's units and sacrificing them, very powerful interactions there, lots of late game, and a deck that has the potential to become better because you can simply just cut it down to 50 cards and make the deck more consistent and make you find the card that you need whenever you need them more consistently because you have lesser cards in your deck. And so this is once again a deck that had a huge impact on the meta, that is having a big impact on meta as we're speaking right now, because kind of we're talking about today's meta now. Palpatine has never been more popular, and I think one of the reasons is because this deck exists. Next, obviously, I was going to talk about my Bosk Blue that won me the Birmingham tournaments, 201 players, biggest tournaments in set 3 so far, and I believe it's likely to be the one of the, unless the Spanish player decide to organize another massive tournament. But yeah, it is one of the biggest tournaments of entire Star Wars Unlimited, and basically this is just the evolution of the set 3 of the set 2 Bosks that won the Barcelona tournament, just changed with the new list, adapting to the new meta. So we got Merciless Contest, Perilous Position being added to the roster as not a huge difference. I'm not going to talk too much about it. Also, some meta evolution makes it easier to play Pershing, that kind of thing. So just a very, very solid list that triggered basically, that puts Out Control on the map in set 3. And I don't think before I played this tournament, nobody expected Out Control to come in this meta that strong. And my win at Birmingham triggered everybody to start playing Out Control in this new meta, and finding that it's one of the strongest deck in the game at the moment. So, and the set 3 had some very powerful card that makes a huge difference. Merciless Contest and Paris Position are a huge addition to this list. Last but not least, we got Cad Bane Red, which had some really good results in Birmingham, and also and won the PQ Bologna. So this is the list that won the PQ Bologna. And this list is incredible because it's very it has so Cad Bane has always been a very good leader, but living in the shadows of boba. But after the boba ban, it was now possible to play Cad Bane in a mid-range shell and not being just a worse version of boba. So this version is a mid-range deck. It uses now there's 2 of them in order to cheat a massive unit in play early on. So it has loads of like powerful interaction like this. It's very strong against aggro because of Cad Bane's ability combined with Starking Town to take over the board early on in the game. Very good use of McClunky, and it's able to win the late game because it has some powerful late game tool with the new Cad Bane, which is a huge addition to this deck, and the ability, of course, to be aggressive, and has a huge turn 6 play with a Ruthless Raider. So it's just a very solid list. It has struggles against control, but even against control, it does some games. There's the Bazine, we got the Lucky TIE Phantoms on the sideboard. So it's not a great deck against control, but it against everything else, it's a very solid deck. And is another like benefit of Boba being banned is like it gives more room for those kind of new like cunning black mid-range decks. And that is it. That is all the lists that I've decided to feature in this. Obviously, I could have featured many other lists. I could have... The Queenland Tarkin Town is a deck that in set 3 is having some legs, even though he hasn't done any strong tournament wins so far. There's obviously... I mean, I could have featured the Sabine in set 3, which is one of the strongest deck in set 3, but basically the Sabine in set 3 is pretty much the same as the Sabine in set 2. So it's not really more point in talking about it. There's many other decks I could have talked about, but this is the this is the 24 list, sorry, the 20 list that I decided to talk about for this article, for this video. And yeah, so looking back in 2024, overall, I'm relatively satisfied with the diversity of the meta, specifically in set 1, in the second half of set 1, on the first half of set 2, and so far on set 3. I think the meta diversity is very good. It was bad early on in set 1, and it was bad later on in set 2. Sorry. So when it was dominated by boba, basically. And now that boba has been banned, I'm relatively hopeful. One thing that I found was regrettable. So there's basically, if I had to summarize, there's two negative things. Obviously, boba being too strong, the first big negative, and the second big negative is set 3 being too weak. I think set 3 did not have enough of an impact on the meta. As you can see, most of the list that were features in set 3 were just updated version of previous decks, and also they feature very, very few cards from the new set. And I think that I genuinely believe that the boba ban had a bigger impact on the meta than the entire set 3 together. So, but yeah, I'm really hopeful for the future. I think that so far it was a great first year of competitive play for Star Wars Unlimited. It was very enjoyable, the wide variety of different decks. I mean, as diverse as you can hope for, I think, in the early stages of the game. And I think this video gives you a very clear idea on how this year went in terms of like what were the decks that were featured, that were played. Thank you so much for following this video, and I will publish another video on the 31st. This is not the last video of the year 2024. The next video I'll talk about will be more based on the most impactful cards of 2024. Here we talked about the decks, and yeah. Thank you so much for following that video, and I'll see you next time.